and I think that what has been really powerful for me about that is seeing, big companies that have historically, had a very restricted approach to hiring, start to open up their funnel and really consider folks that they would have never given a chance to before. And I think that those are the types of moments where I think it would be hard to go back to something that didn't have the potential for impact the way that this does. And again, we call neuroscience soft skills. I'm sorry, it sounds very jargony, I'm sure, but really what we're trying to measure in people are cognitive, social, and emotional features or traits or whatever you want to call them. The world of workforce decisions called them soft skills as opposed to hard skills, which is like what you have on your resume. And the things that I think are really great about our system and other forms of acquiring information about people that isn't just their hard skills on a resume are the 4 things that I put up on the screen here, which is they really are more durable, especially now during COVID, where so many people are being displaced from industries that they might have worked in for decades. I really think we need to help people feel like they still have a purpose in the world, and that, just because they were in retail and retail is shrinking doesn't mean that they don't have a purpose. And I think you see a lot of that hopelessness in the world today. The second thing is that they're future facing. So our system can tell you that you could be a good fit for many jobs that you may never have done before. And it can really encourage people, I think, to think more futuristically about what could I do rather than what have I done. The third thing, and this is very borne out in our data, is that it is a pathway to greater economic opportunities. So unfortunately, hard skills can still be very tracked depending on where you started out. And there's lots of data to support this versus soft skills, not so much. And also all of the measures that we have are pretty equally distributed and unbiased. We've looked at sort of population level differences in the features that we measure for gender, and there are almost none. And again, we did that on purpose. I mean, we didn't select certain measurement assays that we thought might be more problematic for gender and ethnicity. But we still get really great results in terms of being able to differentiate amongst people in terms of what occupations they may be best suited for. And we also see strong correlations with the people that we recommend for certain professions and their performance in a job. So even though we've sort of optimized the system for what we would call fairness, we still see some really strong results. So to answer your question, Zainab, I think I would consider sort of more of an applied avenue, but I think that I just think having had the ability to have impact on people and really feeling like I can make an immediate difference, not to say science is an amazing, wonderful endeavor, and I will always consider myself a scientist. I think what I learned during my graduate years and postdoc years is that I'm somewhat impatient, and therefore the timeline of scientific impact, I think for me, was a little less appealing than sort of more of the immediate time frame, if that makes sense to people. So, but I think both are equally important. Any other questions just about sort of the path from MIT to what I do now?
Yes, I will.
Go for it.
So how did, I know the answer, but how did you get set up? So do you think that like your MBA helped you get set up for this, or what types of things did you
Yeah, definitely. So again, I think that, and I don't have slides on this, I'm sorry, it's just more something I speak to more than anything else. So, was a postdoc for 3 years. During that time, did a bunch of things to kind of explore entrepreneurship. So I took a class at MIT with Ed Boyden, Neurotech Ventures, which I don't know if that's still going, but that was really interesting. That was kind of my first foray into, oh, wow, we can actually sort of do something entrepreneurial with the science that we're developing. And I think that's harder for behavioral scientists, neuroscience scientists than it is like a chemist or a biologist, where there's like a long pathway of people like spinning out, some sort of like a material sciences company or something like that. So that was kind of the first inkling that I had, like, oh, this is possible. And then getting my MBA was a really, I think, important pathway to that. Now, I think there are other ways that you could start a company out of academia. As Zainab knows, at the time that I was a postdoc, I was also, I had a really young child. She was 1 when I started my postdoc. And I was also a single parent. So that made it more constraining in terms of what I could do. Like I couldn't go work for McKinsey for 3 years and, never see my child. So I think that led me to thinking an MBA was the most optimal pathway for me, but I think there are other pathways. So how did, you know, an MBA help? I think it helped tremendously, in the sense that all of the data that we collected on Pymetrics, like, so basically, you know, it's the system where we have, you know, people go through things like the flanker, the NBAC tower, like the towers of Hanoi, to name but a few of the different assays that we've taken from neuroscience research. So we have a suite of 17 assays at this point that we've developed. And we started testing these things out at HBS. So again, HBS, or MBA students in general, somewhat, you know, have some time on their hands, interested in learning more about themselves. And we also have data as to what professions they've been in and are going into. So that was a great training set to say, okay, we can distribute this among not only HBS students, but also the broader MBA community, get a lot of people to go through the system and see if our algorithms can actually distinguish between, let's say, people that have been in, you know, finance versus marketing versus consulting or something like that. And so that in and of itself, stand-up was like a really important piece of starting the company, in the sense that we were able to train and get some early proof points that, hey, this thing actually works and it's not just a theoretical. So that's one way in which it was super helpful. The second way is that there were actually companies coming there to recruit. So when we wanted to say to a company, and we did, like, hey, we think our technology can help you, we were able to approach them and say, will you let us test it out? And they were not that receptive, actually. They were kind of like, we're too busy, but we did get some to let us play around with their data. So that was one critical way that it was important. The second critical way that it was important was that it actually introduced us to people who had similar pathways. So we ended up raising our first, so we're a venture-backed company. We've raised $58 million to date. That the beginning of that was a $2 million, what's called a seed round, from an investment firm called Khosla Ventures. So Vinod Khosla was early Sun Microsystems, and he's actually built a venture firm that really does focus a lot on taking science that was developed for some other purpose and using it sort of outside of its original purpose. So we fit squarely into the types of companies that they thought were interesting. And actually, Zainab, somebody else who's not getting funding through Khosla, but who is going down this path and who you might want to also invite is Nadine Gobb, if you remember Nadine. So she's also developed an assay, this one in the educational space. It's a dyslexia screener, but similar type of system where they're using sort of cognitive science or behavioral science tools to address a problem that's not squarely within the research world. Anyway, so the introduction to our initial VC firm was through the Harvard Business School network. And I think that was really critical as well. And that kind of got us started down the path that we are today. And, you know, quite frankly, I think it's like any other thing, like, you know, PhD will give you access to the networks of your advisor and your school and everything else. It's the same with an MBA program, and there's no difference really, other than the networks tend to be somewhat different. But I think it has actually been, so that's how I think an MBA helps. And other people have gone on to get MBAs and do something slightly different with them. I mean, it depends on what you're interested in doing. And obviously, you know, Nadine is a great example of somebody who is going to remain in academia and is going to, has found a CEO for the company that she started. But I think it was really great when she's thought about putting this company together, which is about a year or more ago. She contacted me and I was able to kind of give her some advice and whatnot. And, you know, she's been really, I think, benefited from, you know, other people having sort of gone down that path before her. And it's just been nice to be able to see that with her and others, where, you know, you're taking some sort of scientific, you know, a discovery or insight or whatever it is, and actually applying it to a business problem or an applied problem. Because I think a lot of times what we do in academia is undervalued because people don't really see how it applies, right? And I think there's just that disconnect of, oh, there's, you know, all these people doing research over here, but we have all these real world problems. And I think it's really great when we can actually show, like, well, and again, a lot of innovation comes from cross-pollination of disciplines. So I think this is not like an insight I've had, it's just an insight in general that I think taking, you know, merging different disciplines can really be super helpful in coming up with solutions that would have not been, you know, conceived of previously. So does that help answer the question, Zainab, of like, if it was helpful or how I thought it was helpful or what the pathway was. Does anyone else have any questions about sort of taking the leap or any interest in that or other non-traditional pathways that I might have come across in the last 8 years since I left? Everyone is either.
I have a question about like the riskiness of starting your own company compared to the academic path.
Sure.
And your perspective in being in both.
And how would you define risk? Are you thinking about financial risk, reputational risk? What kind of risk are you thinking about, or all of the above?
Somewhat all of the above, but you know, like in academia, a lot of people can't stay in academia, but also starting a business is inherently very fragile as well.
Yes.
So just in general, your take on things.
I mean, look, I think there's risk in every aspect of life. So I think it's hard to quantify that, you know, completely, but I do think, yes, there is more risk of failure, I think, in starting a venture. I think that, you know, the rates are pretty telling. I think it's, you know, 1 out of 10 is successful or something like that. It depends on how you define a venture, but so there's definitely more risk. And, you know, people often ask me like, oh my goodness, you did this as a single parent. Like, what were you thinking? You know, and I actually have this really funny story where my father is, you know, this very traditional Italian man. I was raised in Italy. And when I told him, and he thought I was going to go to business school and, you know, get a nice stable career. And when I told him that, you know, I was planning on starting a business, he was like, "Ma Frida, cosa fai?" And that means in Italian, it's basically, you know, like, what the hell are you doing? So he was not that excited and thought it was super risky. However, that having been said, I think, you know, it does, again, it's all back to, I think, a little bit knowing who you are as a person. And I think that I wanted to do something that was a little bit more risky. And so it suited me, but I would say that, yes, it's not for everybody. And I do think that there is a lot of, I mean, you're creating something new that hasn't existed before. So inherently you're doing something that is risky. And you're also, you know, taking other people's money, which should make anyone feel, you know, somewhat nervous. So there's that additional element to it. And, you know, you're also, you know, going to selling a product to a business that you say is going to have this particular outcome. And that also is not without risk. So I would definitely say it's riskier, but I think for me, it was something that I think was a better fit with my inherent disposition than not. My dad's come around. What other questions? Any other questions about entrepreneurship? Or I will also, one thing I will make a comment is far more gender imbalanced than my experience as a scientist. And again, you know, it's probably because I was a neuroscientist and not a physicist, but definitely the single digit club, certainly when I started was a reality. I had never, I mean, when I go to my venture firm CEO gathering, you know, it's like me, 2 to 3 other women, and then a sea of men. And it is definitely not uncommon for that to be the case. So I definitely think that was something that was very striking to me. I'd never really been in that environment since math classes in high school. So I think, you know, just something to note. And I think it's gotten a lot better. And I think it's actually an opportunity for women or people of color even less represented, I would say, in entrepreneurship, especially at, you know, CEO level or C level. But it's just something else that I think was something that, you know, we needed to navigate, myself and Julie, because it's even more rare for a woman, a company to be woman co-founded, especially in the technical space. It's not uncommon for a shoe company or a toothbrush company or something like that. But in the technical space, we're actually developing algorithms and stuff like that. It's not that common. So if anyone is thinking or wondering about that. I see some heads nodding. Any other questions on any aspect of that? This isn't your only chance, but if you have a burning question, don't be shy. Someone else is probably wondering the same thing.
Hi, I have a question.
Go for it.
So I feel like in these PhD programs, we tend to like narrowly focus on developing expertise in sometimes a very specific area.
Yep.
And so I wonder if you have any insights into how you can kind of see yourself or market yourself in realms where like you're not necessarily researching you know,
Right.
how an eye can saccade to a, you know, a red dot on a display.
Which, by the way, I did saccadic research for at least 2 years of my PhD program. So, you know, I think that's a great question. And I think the general answer I would have to that is that a lot of what we learn in science, so we become domain experts in something, right? And back in the day, I was a domain expert in something. However, I think the general tools and methodologies of a scientist are actually far, far more applicable than not, if that makes sense, right? And sort of like, you know, things that we take for granted, things that you learn in your first year of your PhD program are things that are very generalizable. Does that make sense? So like your domain expertise may be less generalizable, but you're certainly the sort of the fundamental basics of science are, in my opinion, way more marketable than scientists give themselves credit for. And that I think is very well applied to many fields. And I also think that, you know, and then there have been books on this, and I'm forgetting the name of one that's really helpful, but there have been books on, or certainly people writing about how domain expertise in one field, when applied to a completely different field, can actually unlock solutions that no one had ever thought of before, right? And I can't think of an example right now, but that is definitely something that I think is relatively well known. So even though you might think, oh my goodness, I only know about, you know, this particular thing and it's so specific, which by the way, that is absolutely true. That domain expertise, oftentimes, you know, you can pattern recognize that onto something that has, that is completely dissimilar. And I can't tell you what your specific, you know, jump would be or what field, but there have been so many examples of that. In general, there's a good book called Range, in case anyone is interested in some light reading, that sort of speaks to this about how actually, you know, we have this myth of, and it was sort of propagated by, you know, Bill Gates and sort of the 10,000 hours rule. It's a really good book. Range is the title. It sort of debunks the 10,000 hours rule, which basically says, you know, if you want to become an expert in something, you should go and, you know, it's 10,000 hours of practice. And basically what this author sort of learns or exposes is that is very true in things like golf and coding, where the rules are extremely clear, or chess, where the rules are extremely clear and, you know, there's not a lot of gray area. But that is actually not true for most things in life where that's not the case. And so the reason I'm saying that is because I think that you know, our ability to be more broad, I think, is hugely beneficial. And even if we have become domain experts, it actually can be a benefit to then jumping to a completely different field and sort of solving things in a way that field hadn't thought of before, if that makes sense. And I mean, to give you the Pymetrics example, I mean, you know, I was a neuroscientist, and now we work squarely in the area of a bunch of different areas, but one of the areas is, you know, obviously workforce decisions, and that intersects with several domains. It intersects with, you know, industrial organizational psychology, if you guys have ever heard of that, which by the way has never been exposed to many of the things that, you know, we as neuroscientists consider sort of basic. It intersects with the law. As much as I think I would make a terrible lawyer, and I don't think like a lawyer, we have really had to wrap our heads around employment law, and all of the ways in which employment law sort of intersects with, you know, what we're doing. And so there are many fields that we've had to then, we, the team in general, have had to, you know, become not experts, but, you know, semi-experts in, and really lending our thinking to those fields, I think has really broadened our understanding of things, but also the people that we've come into contact with. So I do think it's a little riskier for sure, and it can feel like you're kind of demoting yourself because you go from being an expert to sort of being a novice. But I think it is really can be beneficial for not only individually, but also just in general for the world, to sort of be, you know, cross-functional or cross-disciplinary.
Well, thank you for that answer. And I kind of have like a follow-up that kind of takes us in a different direction though.
Go for it.
I was wondering, what kind of challenges have you faced in collaborating with people who may not be as familiar with like the scientific method and like working in academia? And, like, what's that like? Like, how is that? Because you kind of
like 99% of the people that we interact with these days. So, I mean, honestly, I think there have been multiple challenges. One is that you have to assume the things that we take for granted, you know, like what is a p-value? The vast majority of people have no idea what a p-value is, and they don't, and it's just a fact. I mean, you know, we can lament it, we can say science education should be better, but I'm just being fully transparent that, you know, like, I think maybe it's not 99% of people, but it's, you know, unfortunately it's not a small number of people really don't know that. And that does not make them dumb or anything. It just means that they were not exposed to that. So my point in saying this is I think you have to learn how to explain things in simple ways. And I actually think the best way to do that is via analogy. Like, I think you can usually find an analogy for what you're trying to say that helps the layperson understand what you're doing without making them feel like they have to take, you know, a college level math class. So that I think is super important. And the second thing, I think if you want to be really effective, you can't talk down to people. You can't be like, oh, well, you don't know what a p-value is. That means you're, you know, unintelligent. And I just think that that's the wrong approach in general. And I think that's why people, you know, anyway, people end up not being able to talk to each other. So there have been, like, you know, serious challenges just in sort of educating people on basic scientific facts, right? Then I think the other challenges we've had, so I'll give you a perfect example, okay? When you are doing anything in the world of hiring, you have to take into consideration employment law, which of course you should. Employment law basically says that in order for a hiring tool to be fair, it should have essentially what's called statistical parity. So you know what that is. Statistical parity isn't exactly what we would define it as. They've sort of codified it into law by saying that if an employment selection tool selects 10 people of one particular group, it can select no fewer than 8 people from a different group. It's called the 4/5 rule. It's a thing. That's one definition of statistical parity, which is great. But then the other thing that the law will look at is, well, do you have any statistically significant difference in your outcomes? Well, you can imagine when you're processing hundreds of thousands of people, even the slightest difference in your technology with respect to men and women will become statistically significant just by the law of big numbers. That is, and I'm just giving you a real world example that we dealt with as recently as last week, hard to explain to lawyers. And I know that sounds crazy because how can they not understand that basic fact? But I'm telling you, they were trained in law school, that it's a totally different way of thinking. It's like, well, the case law says, and I'm like, I know what the case law says, but that case law was 50 years old when people weren't dealing with hundreds of thousands of people. And at this point, that's what you're dealing with in the age of internet applications. And so it's just things like that. And it's really trying to understand that different frameworks have sprung up in different industries that oftentimes, you know, are at cross purposes. I'll give you another one that I think is really, you know, even more relevant, I think, for this audience. Like, so, you know, we think about, you know, neurodiversity, right? We think about people with mental, you know, differences, basically, whether it's Asperger's or whatever it is, right? And we think of them as falling on the spectrum, and that, at least I'm going to speak for myself. I think of them as falling on the spectrum, and that spectrum has some adaptive advantages as well as some disadvantages, right? And that is sort of generally captured in the idea of neurodiversity. That again intersects poorly with employment law that basically says, you know, all people with disabilities must be treated equally. And again, I completely agree with that. I don't think we should be discriminating. However, what if people with certain neurodiversity leanings, let's say whether it's, you know, Asperger's or something else, are actually inherently more suited for certain occupations, which is, I think, what, you know, the data would show. It intersects poorly with this idea that everyone has to be equal on everything. Does that make sense? And that's just another way in which, you know, legal frameworks don't ultimately account necessarily for some of the things that we've learned, you know, as scientists. However, I do think that, like, us branching out and teaching people these types of things is really important, because you know, like, I didn't know anything about employment law before I started this, and that's, you know, my failing as much as it is, you know, lawyers not understanding, you know, science truisms like statistical significance is a law of big numbers. So is that helpful in terms of just helping sort of generally frame, you know, some of the challenges that we've had in talking to large groups of people that really don't have a background in anything that, you know, we on this Zoom might think is kind of basic? I don't know if that's encouraging or discouraging, but but it's a reality. So I see
kind
that because we have to be like, you know, emissaries. We have to go out into new territories and, you know, kind of explain the value of science and why it's important and why it matters to these, you know, types of other fields. Sorry, I interrupted somebody.
I'm sorry, we were vibrating at the same wavelength. So I feel like a theme here is like communication, and I feel like in your PhD work, like you're obviously getting a lot of training in communication, but communication in like a really specialized domain. And so I'm wondering for you, what were experiences that you had, or like basically where were you learning these communication skills for communicating to audience outside of academics? And yeah, where did those skills come from? And
well, that's a great question. So I think honestly, so I mean, I don't know how much exposure you guys have had to grant writing, but I think that actually grant writing and conference presentations and things like that are a place where scientists can develop a broader ability to communicate. Because I think at the end of the day, even if, and again, I don't want to assume anything, but I do think that you know, people who ultimately I think are really successful, even if they remain in science, I think it is all about communicating the importance of your ideas, right? Would you guys generally agree with that? I don't know, nodding heads, no, I don't know, something like that. That's sort of the way that I think, you know, even if you look within science, it's really folks that can communicate why what they're doing is important and how it matters. And again, sometimes we would make fun of it, right? Because we wanted to study a disorder and we had to make it applicable to, you know, or vice versa. We wanted to study a process in normal human beings and we had to make it applicable to some disorder to get funding. But I think taking a broader view of things is always important. And so I think it's just a skill, like hopefully that we try to develop throughout our lifetime to help us in whatever overarching goal we might have, whether it's stay in science to really communicate why what we're doing is so important, or if we want to, you know, branch outside of science. So I think it's something you kind of can have opportunity to develop within the scientific context, but then there are always other ways to further develop that. And I mean, I think academia is such a rich environment for exposing yourself to many things, right? I mean, like I said, when I was a postdoc at MIT, I did all sorts of stuff. I took a class at the business school that was commercializing science and inventing breakthroughs. I took a class at Ed Boyden's, you know, teaching, you know, on neurotechnology ventures. So I think just branching out and learning new things in whatever context helps you to communicate the value of whatever it is that you're working on, you know. Great. Athena also got her question answered, so that's great. Cool. All right. So any other questions then? I'm happy to sort of dive into just some of the technical stuff that we've done, which might be sort of more directly applicable to how did a scientist like me end up doing what they're doing. Does that sound like a good time to transition to some of that? Is that helpful? Yes? Okay. Okie dokie. So, okay, great. And this is a talk that our director of data science gave. So some of the slides I'm not as familiar with, but I think they will serve the purpose. So, cool. Okay, great. So this is just a kind of talk that goes through, we call them games, don't cringe. It's just because when you call them scientific exercises, people don't think they sound as fun. So we call them games. So really it's talking about our measurements, our factors, and sort of the idea of measurement validity. So, and again, if this is too boring, we can fast forward, but essentially, you know, when we think about measurement validity, there are a number of different things that, you know, we have to take into consideration. And, you know, we'll kind of get into a lot of the details as we kind of go through the slide, but I just kind of wanted to give you an overview of some of the things that, you know, are important in terms of measurement validity, the quality of the data, you know, it's basically the quality of measurement directly impacts predictiveness, validity, and all sorts of other things. That's kind of obvious. Then in this, we can also talk to how we review the data used to build the models, how the games are designed, what they measure and how they're validated. And then a more detailed description of all the measures from the games. And you'll recognize, you know, some of them. So and again, I think that, you know, what is less known to this group or audience probably is just, you know, once we went from being a research tool to a hiring tool, we then squarely landed in the field of assessment. So assessment is, you know, kind of broad. It could, you know, refer to things like the SAT, it could refer to hiring tools, it could refer to a lot of different things. I mean, obviously it could refer to neuropsychological assessment where you're doing clinical work, but you know, you have to start thinking about things a little bit differently than if you're just using it as a research tool, because research tools, generally speaking, talk about group differences. We do look at individual differences, obviously, as well, but the stability of those individual differences is not something that's as critical. And there's just a lot of things that we had to start thinking more in depth about once we started using these research tools as actual assessments. And so Lewis has a very dry sense of humor. As a total side note, he ended up doing his PhD in a lab where an RA from my PhD had gone. So it's a very small world, even once you leave academia. But anyways, very brief history of assessment. The TLDR is it hasn't been great. And so we kind of get into some of the reasons for, you know, why that hasn't necessarily, assessment in general hasn't been as wonderful as, you know, we might have liked. And by the way, this isn't, so sorry, I started reading this book called The Mismeasure of Man. If you guys have had a chance to read it recently, it's Stephen Jay Gould. He basically talks a lot about some of the challenges that we've seen in our work. I think one of the biggest obstacles that we've come across is that people, when they think about assessment, often hone in on the concept of G. And this idea of G, not to say it doesn't have value, it absolutely has value, but I think there are some things about G that have really been misused over time. One is that it's highly hereditable. Two is that it's, you know, extremely stable. And three is that it's a unitary concept. And these are points that Gould makes in his book, The Mismeasure of Man. And actually that idea of G perverts what Stanford, Binet, and others who started thinking about G originally had developed G as a measure of. And we'll see as we go into employment selection how problematic this really has become. And again, this is not to say that G isn't a useful concept. It certainly is, but I think there are some limitations, and I think we'll kind of get into some of them. So anyways, so we're just talking about, you know, Stanford Binet. He was the first person, the Stanford Binet was one of the first IQ tests that were developed. And it was initially designed to, essentially the idea behind it was to detect mental retardation and to try to help the folks that were most in need of help in terms of that. But then what has happened kind of over time is that intelligence has been, for better or worse, I think, then become strongly linked to being Caucasian and to being of better socioeconomic status. And that has sort of played out, you know, over time. And so this is just an example whereby if you give somebody this, this sample question, which is from a standardized test, and it says, you know, Cardinals College, Buffalo, what is that? What's the correct analogy here? Herd is not the correct analogy. Sorry, the correct analogy is dependent on the idea that a college of cardinals is a group of leaders in the Catholic Church, and this question favors people with a classical Christian education. And even to this date, what's always shocking to me is some of these more traditional forms of standardized testing, whether it's personality questionnaires or what we call general mental ability tests, continue to have this tie to, you know, Western culture for sure, certain socioeconomic groups, statuses for sure. And, you know, it's just striking to me, especially in, you know, the year 2020, that we're still grappling with a lot of these issues. So this is just to go on to say that, you know, obviously there's been a whole host of, you know, attempts at assessment for a variety of different things. And that they've developed, you know, sort of standards of validity. So, you know, all measures need to be empirically validated. They need to target meaningful traits. The measures that we look at are behavioral. The other difference, so again, quite different from some of these, you know, sort of self-report tools that we'll get to in a minute. The measures that we have developed are multi-directional. So this is something that is very much in sort of direct contrast to an IQ test where, and again, this, you know, I actually gave a talk yesterday to a group of interns in a neuropsychology program. So my advisor in my PhD program was a woman named Edith Kaplan. So Edith Kaplan really sort of, and not only her, but other folks like Luria and other behavioral neurologists really developed this notion of the process method. So the process method basically says it's less important how you derive what the ultimate score is. It's more important how you got there. And so this whole idea of multi-directional assessment really kind of falls into that to a certain extent, where we're less interested in a unitary measure. We're more interested in how you got to that unitary number. And also that number isn't unidirectional. Like it's basically a spectrum approach. It's like this or that end of the spectrum, you know, could be a good fit depending on what you're trying to optimize for. The fifth thing we try to do is we try to have measures that minimize inherent bias, and that bias can be defined as, you know, racial, gender, and socioeconomic bias. We try to have measures that can be completed quickly enough in the context of, you know, a job application, and the measures we, as Lewis says, should be sort of fun. They don't have to be uber fun, but they should be sort of fun. So I'm just going to walk through kind of like all the different ways in which, you know, Pymetrics tests sort of fall into, like, comply with these standards, and then happy to sort of chat with you guys about some of these things. So again, excuse the fact that we call them games, but all of the scientific exercises are direct adaptations from the peer-reviewed literature that you guys are familiar with. So again, you know, for example, we have a flanker task. You guys are all probably familiar with a flanker task, and all we've done is sort of adapt that and made it a little bit more colorful, and not an E-prime or whatever statistical software you guys are using these days. And, you know, that's sort of the gist of where all of the tools that we have taken stem from. So does anybody have any questions there? And I can, any thoughts? And most of them are cognitive science tools. Some fall a little bit outside of that. So we have the dictator game, if you guys are familiar with that, where it's sort of a money exchange situation. But that, you know, again, I became familiar with the dictator game because it was being used in oxytocin research around altruism. So all of the tools that we use really are ones that we encountered. And I say we, because again, I'm not the only neuroscientist on the team, sort of encountered in our graduate work or postdoc work in terms of measuring things. Any particular questions about this before I move on?
How do you choose which, like, version of the tasks to use? Because there are so many variabilities, like, within each one. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, that's a great question. And I think, so this is bringing me back sort of 9 years, because, you know, when we started doing this, when we started doing the adaptation of the games, we did a pretty in-depth peer review of the existing literature, which at this point is probably dated. It, you know, so what we had to do was, you know, just like you would in science, we had to say, okay, well, in the context of work, what is it that people are trying to understand, and really try to map the things that they wanted to know about somebody to the different versions, to your point, of a task and what that might measure. Does that make sense? So it was really trying to select for the version of a particular task. Well, first of all, the task, and then secondly, the version that would answer as best one could estimate the translation of what someone in, you know, a decision-making mode around employment would want to understand. Is that helpful? Cool. All right, cool. So the second thing, you know, really is that it has to be targeted. And so these are some of the different things that we look at in terms of the actual measurements, essentially, that we extract. And usually for any particular exercise, we're extracting, you know, on the low end, maybe 6 measurements, on the high end, 12 measurements. And those are obviously averaged across trials, right? So then we had to figure out what's the right number of trials and how many trials do we need to make it stable, and so on and so forth. So very typical stuff that you guys would be thinking about, you know, when you're designing experiments. So any particular questions here? Otherwise, I think this is probably relatively straightforward. Nope, okay. So then the next piece is probably, you know, sort of second nature to you guys, but, you know, in the area of employment, most tools that existed honestly before Pymetrics were not behavioral. So they relied on personality questionnaires, basically based on the Big Five, framework, and also on what we would call, these general mental ability tests, which, I mean, it's behavioral-ish in the sense that they're power tests, so they're a little different than personality tests, but certainly not measuring somebody's behavior. And so the fact that Pymetrics came along, and now there are others, but back in the day, it was actually quite a shock to people that we would be measuring behavior as a way to understand something about people. I know that obviously comes kind of second nature to this group, but outside of our circles, even in scientific circles, I don't think it's a well understood concept, which I know might sound shocking to you guys, that you can measure behavior and that might tell you something about someone. And people are more accustomed to looking at things like, this personality test or this fill in the blank, multiple choice question. So that was something else that we really had to spend a lot of time educating people on, why these behavioral tools had come to be, how valid they were, how reliable they were, and so on and so forth. So that was interesting because a lot of times we were having conversations with other scientists who had been trained differently and had no idea that these tools existed or had a very different conception of these tools than perhaps our conception. So any questions about the behavioral aspect and the education we had to do here? Nope, okay. Multi-directional, so this is back to the concept that I was, kind of alluding to earlier, which is that, generally speaking, G is a unidirectional measurement trait. Most people want to score higher on G than not. And unfortunately, the linkage of G to employment, and again, I'm not going to get into all of this because there's a long history of it, but intelligence, IQ, general mental ability, through some meta-analyses that we believe and others believe have been, poorly conducted, to say the least, really have sort of expounded this view that general mental ability is the sole best predictor of job performance. Now, I can tell you from looking at Pymetrics data, we don't see that. I think it's because no one has ever really looked at multi-directional measurements before, I think, and it's also because they've aggregated the data in ways that I think are highly problematic. But we, what we were not up against is too strong a word, but traditional thinking from industrial organizational psychologists is that IQ is bar none the sole best predictor of job success on almost all jobs, right? And when I first heard that, I just thought, really? Because there are so many jobs where I don't know that linkage really, would matter as much. And even for jobs where it does matter, what we heard from companies, and again, this is back in my business school days, what we heard from companies is like, yeah, maybe there's like a level at which, below a certain level, people might not be performing as well. But once you're sort of past that level, and it wasn't like Mensa level, it was, kind of more average than that, there are lots of other factors that differentiate people from sort of doing the job well. And a lot of them had to do with soft skills and other things that were not captured by G. So the reason I'm harping on this is because I think multi-directional measures are really critical. And so all of the things that we measure, and so this is just a slide to say IQ, generally speaking, is not viewed as multi-directional. But the things that we measure really fall into, there is no one right way to behave on the flanker task that will always make you optimally suited for all jobs. That's just not what our data show. And we've proven that out time and time again. And I think, again, I'm not sure how this lands with this audience. With more traditional audiences who've been thinking about employment assessment for a long time, this was really kind of like, I don't want to say a shockwave, that's too dramatic, but it really was like, it was, somewhat contrary to what a lot of them had been trained to think. And I really think it's it's probably one of the most important things that we do, because I think people hate testing because they think they're going to fail. If you then take a test and you say, there's no way to fail it, it's really all about sorting you into things that, may be better versus worse suited to you. And by the way, if you want to pick something that you don't seem dispositionally well suited for, we would encourage that you do that. We're not trying to limit you. We're just trying to give you one data point to consider. I think then really takes the idea of testing and changes it into something that I think can be viewed as something helpful to a person rather than scary and limiting. So this was actually just a really core difference between what Pymetrics set out to do and what most traditional tools in this space were designed to do. So I'll just pause there and see if anyone has any questions about this or if this makes perfect sense.
I'm wondering, so how do you assess job success? Like, is it based off of the employer or the employee?
Oh boy. I'm just laughing because, so again, industrial organizational psychologists have owned the field for, you know, decades now. And the literature there will tell you that it's tricky to define job success. I think there are ways. Okay, so there are multiple ways you could try to define it, right? Again, it's just a measurement problem. So you could define it via manager ratings. That is probably the most common and also the most problematic. You could define it by looking at hard metrics of success. So if you're in a sales role, you know, how much did you sell? If you're collecting debt, how much debt did you collect? I mean, so on and so forth, right? You could look at it from a perspective of retention. You know, were you more likely to be retained versus not over some period of time? And you can also look at it at length of tenure. So those are 4 common measurements, Zainab. There are probably others. It is one of the more squirrely aspects of what we do because, you know, again, so I don't know how familiar you guys are with implicit bias and how much it impacts hiring, but I'll just give you sort of a high level overview. So there was a PNAS paper that came out a few years ago looking at 30 years worth of resume review audit studies. So an audit study is where a scientist wants to look at the impact of gender or race on hiring. And so what they do is they'll take the exact same resume, they'll just change the name. So instead of John Williams, it's Jane Williams if you're looking at gender, and Jamal if you're looking at race. And basically found that, and this goes back to sort of Daniel Kahneman's System 1 versus System 2 thinking, despite the fact that our System 2 thinking was saying, yes, we want to hire more diverse people and blah, blah, blah. This meta-analysis of 24 studies done over a 3-decade period showed that our System 1 thinking essentially remained unchanged in terms of how much discriminatory impact was detected in these audit studies. So essentially for every 10 Caucasians that were being selected with the exact same resume, only 7 African Americans were being selected. And that is literally, I mean, that is the most, I think, compelling evidence for unconscious bias or System 1 thinking and hiring, because you're not saying this person's any different. It's all the exact same data, but just the name changed. And so the reason I mention that is because there's implicit bias that comes in at the evaluation stage, whether I want to hire someone. And then unfortunately, there has been equal evidence of implicit bias in performance manager ratings, right? And it's not just gender and race. It's, you know, if you went to Harvard or some fancy school, you know, that you have this halo effect, and then everyone sort of ascribes certain things to you that they maybe shouldn't, right? Same with, you know, socioeconomic status and so on. So I think that performance manager ratings are the things that we feel are the most problematic, and that the literature would suggest also are quite problematic. That having been said, they are the most common data points that we have. And so it does become a struggle when we start thinking about how do we measure performance.
Great.
Any other thoughts about that? It is definitely a challenge that we haven't really solved for, but.
Also, so the class officially ends at 2, so people want
to. Oh gosh, I'm sorry, I had this until 2:15. So if we have to end.
We don't, and I'm just saying that anyone who has to go is you know, but I'm, you know, I'd be interested to see 15 more minutes.
Yep, and we can skip through this, and I'm also happy to answer any additional questions. So
how do we do that? If anyone has any questions right now, let's pause here.
Yeah.
I had a question regarding effort. So there's like pretty well demonstrated effects of people like being lazy versus like being fully engaged on even something like a flanker task, right? And that's being reflected in like RTs.
Yeah.
So if you're using that as part of the predictors in your model, how do you control for someone that maybe stayed up all night and like took these tests at 8 a.m.
Sure.
Right, versus a similar applicant who like was well rested and fully engaged?
Totally. I mean, I think that you raise great points that measurement error can be introduced by 100 different things, right? I mean, that's essentially sort of what you're saying. And we do have a fairly robust system in terms of when we're processing the data to flag, flag people or instances where there seems to be too much data missing, where that's not a valid instance of someone having gone through it in a valid way, or likewise, if their RTs are continually going over the time window allotted or something like that. So it's basically, a lot of outlier detection stuff that we do to try to really cut out, both on the applicant side, but then on the, training data side, instances of data that we think could be problematic. If it doesn't get caught by outlier detection, it's harder. And so then it just comes down to trying to instruct people that, again, just like anything else, like if you're going for a job interview, you probably shouldn't stay up all night long beforehand, and kind of the same thing here, like just try to, sort of best practices around well rested, not hungover, all those good things that, you'd hope someone would come to a job interview with. So.
So when are the tests conducted, I guess is kind of my question. And like, do you go through like an online portal and then
Yep, essentially. Yep, that's exactly right. So basically, and the we think the nice part about it is that, you can sort of take it in whatever environment you're most comfortable with. You don't have to do them all in a row. You can take them, you can take one and then come back to it. Again, I'm sure as, research scientists, we're all like, oh my God, the amount of noise you're introducing into the system. And that's true. And that's what I'm saying, like applied sciences is a little different. But yeah, they're sort of not self-directed, but you're allowed to take them sort of at your leisure in an environment of your choice. It's not a proctored test or anything like that.
Okay, thanks.
Cool. You guys want me to finish up the slides? You want to just do like a couple more questions, time of Q&A, whatever you guys want. I am at your disposal.
More questions to ask here? Okay, if not, I'd be curious to see about, the machine learning side of things, especially, sure. Or if you could give us a few.
Absolutely. Let me pull those up quickly. Okay, cool. So yeah, let me just show you a couple of slides on that. So, and again, I think that, the other thing that I always like to say is that, we didn't intend Pymetrics to be uber trendy, but it has become the whole idea of just using machine learning for certain, applications, I think has really, just really become kind of a topic of hot discussion. So this is just kind of giving you sort of the overview of some of the things that we do in terms of pre-processing. And then this is kind of how we, sort of sub-segment out the training data that we're using. So typically we're looking at, high-performing employees at a particular company, and then we're comparing them against a baseline population. And there's a debiasing data set, which then goes back to this idea that we are essentially dual optimizing algorithms for both performance and to meet parity thresholds as described by employment law. I think, what's interesting about the use case that we're dealing with specifically when it comes to machine learning is that, in a standard discrimination task, all of your labels, right? There's no doubt as to whether, like a cat and a dog image classifier, there's hopefully not that much debate as to whether something is a cat and a dog. With employment, I think you're dealing with a slightly different problem, or at least the way that we've set up the problem, because in this baseline population of folks, there may actually be people that could be performing well in a particular job, but they've never had the opportunity to do that job. And I think that that's just generally true of, employment in general, is that your employment history is much more limited in terms of the wide set of possibilities that you could have chosen. And so that's just something that we really had to optimize our machine learning algorithms for, is to really understand that it's a, positive unlabeled learning environment where that just has implications for the classification methodology that we use and the boundary goal. So just pointing that out, because it's not as traditional a machine learning it's not that it's not traditional, but it's a particularly unique set of circumstances that, you know, we're dealing with. The other thing that I will say is that, you know, I think because we work in the field of employment, again, we've sort of talked about how it should predict outcomes. That's obvious. The fact that it has to be fair, and fair as defined by these legal definitions is another constraint that's kind of put on the system because of employment law, which I think is really important. And then the last point that I think is also kind of critical and has received a lot of attention in the news and even in academic circles, quite frankly, is that it should be explainable. So I don't know how much you guys really have thought about explainable AI or glass box AI or whatever you want to call it. But I think there's just a lot of concern nowadays around, you know, black box systems, deep learning systems, whatever, that have little or sort of sketchy explainability, and how those might be used to make, you know, decisions about people's lives in a way that makes people feel uncomfortable, right? And so I think it's just been an interesting, and again, we would not want to do that. And so we have selected, you know, some machine learning methods that are much easier to explain, you know, and I think that in doing that, we sort of constrained ourselves in an additional way as well, which I think is the right thing to do. But I think it's just an area of strong debate, because I think, you know, there are others that would argue, well, there should be no constraints and we should just be maximizing for prediction, and this whole fairness and explainability thing, like that's just you know, more of a nuanced thing that we don't need to take into consideration. However, it's a very real debate that's going out in the field right now. And, you know, just to give you an example, so we're located in New York City. New York City has a number of different efforts that they've put into play to start to try to make algorithms more transparent, and we're completely for it. But there's a whole task force at NYU that is dedicated to this and really trying to set some standards for what does it mean to be explainable? What are, you know, they're sort of labeling it this nutritional label, you know, analogy, and saying it should have this, it should have that, it should have that. So and, you know, just myself, I've, you know, basically a member of IEEE and other working groups to try to start to think about what does fair machine learning mean, what is explainable, and so on. It's just a very complex, I think, field right now that no one has. There's general agreement as to sort of high level principles, but very little agreement in terms of standard practice. And so I think it's been really interesting kind of being on the bleeding edge of that. And this is sort of just how we go about building the algorithms. You know, it's not super complicated, but it's basically a nested search, you know, combined with cross-validation, and then putting it through the initial feature selection. Then there's like the training test loop, and then there is the debiasing data set, which goes back to this whole idea that algorithms have to meet certain specifications in hiring that they might not have to meet otherwise. So I'll pause there and see if anyone has, since we have 4 minutes left, any other questions about machine learning component or any other elements of what I've talked about today.
Hi, Frida. Can you walk me through an example of, you know, taking certain features and then going through and then finally getting the output model? So what is the prediction model? Can you give like a real life example of that? Yeah. Kind of, yeah,
essentially. So I mean, I think the I think it's the exact number of features right now escapes me, but it's, you know, around 100 plus. And so all of those features are put into the model to begin with, and then essentially their impact on other things that we care about, in particular this fairness metric, are then tested in this iterative loop. Does that make sense? And so if a feature is found to be highly impacting the fairness metric on any dimension, it is essentially dropped. And it's sort of an iterative process until, and again, we build hundreds of models. So this is kind of like a processing, you know, computational approach to this. And then we sort of select among the model, and we're iteratively dropping features that are flagged to be problematic. And then we sort of look at the output at the end to say, okay, of these models, which is the one that, and we have sort of performance you know, metrics that we don't want to fall below, like an AUC of, you know, above 0.75 and things like that, that we also don't want to fall below. So it's really a dual optimization problem of like not wanting to cross certain boundaries for selection ratios, the 0.8 rule that I was telling you about, as well as keeping sort of performance metrics in line with certain recall, accuracy, AUC, and whatnot. Is that helpful in terms of like how?
Yeah, it's really helpful. So the features would be some of the neuropsych tests or neuroimaging metrics. And so, and then you kind of subject those to these other principles that you were talking about, like fairness and all of that. And so then for an individual, what ends up being the outcome for them? Is it like a particular job or?
Yeah, so basically as an individual, it's very similar to any other kind of system where you're getting a percentile score for match, right? So think of any recommendation system out there. And so imagine that careers are movies on Netflix, and we would basically give you a match score for all of the different careers that we've built models for as an individual. And then the company would be a more limited set, saying, hey, Zainab applied to, this company, we have 7 different roles. Here's kind of a rank ordered list of roles that seem to be like the most versus least well suited for her. And again, that is combined with other information, like hard skill information. Like I might be recommending Zainab for a software engineering role, but Zainab's never actually coded. So, I mean, that's an extreme example, but there are most likely other requirements that they're looking at. And the objective of our algorithms is to provide, an orthogonal data source to whatever other information they're using, whether it's, a resume review or some other form of data. And by the way, this is always used at the beginning of the funnel. It's not usually generally used to like decide between the 3 finalists or something like that.
And are your models changing continuously as you get more and more data?
Yeah, so they're not continuously changing. Like it's not an ML system where, daily they're changing. And that's sort of frowned upon in this environment, Zainab, because of the employment law strictures that I was kind of referring to earlier. But what we do is we refresh the models at a certain interval so that as people are being reclassified, let's say, into high performance or whatever, that will be reflected in the models that we built. So, but that's an interesting point, because this NYU group that I was mentioning, one of the things they want to have flagged for machine learning algorithms used in hiring is that they have temporal stability, right? Because that makes sense. I mean, imagine if today I apply and I'm pass through or whatever, and the next day I apply and I'm not, like that would be a bit weird, you know what I'm saying? And so that's one of the things that in certain use cases of machine learning is sort of frowned upon.
Awesome.
Great. Well, it's been so good to chat with you guys. Hopefully you learned something new about what you can do if you want to, I don't know, go outside the lab or, get a bullshit degree called an MBA or something like that. And it's so good to see you, Zainab, and to be able to speak to, to you guys. So
thanks again.
Really appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, guys. Take care. Bye.